She made a promise to bring her best friend home. The airline tried to stop her. What happened next left everyone speechless. Naomi Brooks had been in uniform for 12 years. She'd been through deployments that tested every part of her, mind, body, and soul. But nothing had ever weighed on her the way this did. She was escorting her best friend home. Corporal Devin Hayes wasn't supposed to be in that flag-draped casket. He was supposed to be joking with her about how much better he was at poker, arguing over which diner in San Diego had the best breakfast, or telling her she took life too seriously. But war had different plans. 1 second, they were side by side, pushing through their final mission overseas. The next, he was gone. And before they loaded his body onto the transport, she made a promise to his mother. She would bring him home. Not a stranger, not some faceless process. Her. So when she stepped into the bustling terminal at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, uniform crisp, duffel slung over her shoulder, she didn't think about the noise or the rush of travelers around her. Her only focus was getting Devin back to Wichita, Kansas, where his family waited, shattered but holding on. Naomi had done her part through the official channels. Military transport had brought them stateside, and now commercial airlines would take them the rest of the way. She had the paperwork, the clearance, everything squared away. But still, her gut wouldn't settle. Something felt off. She checked her ticket. Gate B-17. Departure was in 90 minutes. More than enough time. She adjusted her grip on her bag and moved toward the gate, her eyes darting to the tarmac through the large windows. The cargo hold of their aircraft was open, but she couldn't see Devin's casket yet. That was normal. The escorting process didn't usually run into problems. Usually. As she reached the gate, the airline agent behind the desk barely glanced at her, before continuing her conversation with a co-worker. Naomi stood there for a moment, waiting, until finally, the agent sighed and turned her attention over. "Can I help you? I'm Sergeant Naomi Brooks. I'm escorting Corporal Devin Hayes to Wichita." She handed over her paperwork, her voice steady. "I just need to confirm the procedure once we land." The agent frowned, flipping through the documents with a furrowed brow. She clicked a few keys on her computer, squinted at the screen, and then sighed again. This time, with something Naomi couldn't quite place. "That's actually going to be a problem," the woman said. Naomi's jaw tightened. "What kind of problem?" "Your layover in Dallas. Our policy doesn't allow escorts to remain with the casket during transfers. You'll have to take a separate flight from the remains." Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs. No, that's not happening. She wasn't leaving Devin alone. She had promised. But the agent didn't seem to care. Naomi blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. "I'm sorry. What?" The gate agent exhaled sharply, like she was already exhausted by this conversation. "Our policy doesn't allow escorts to stay with remains during transfers at certain layover locations," she repeated. "You'll be placed on a separate connecting flight to Wichita while the casket continues on its scheduled route." Naomi's grip tightened on her duffel strap. "No, absolutely not. That's not an option," she said, voice steady but firm. "I'm his escort. I stay with him." The woman shook her head, clicking through her computer screen. "I understand, Sergeant Brooks, but it's out of my hands. You'll rejoin the remains in Wichita. I'm not meeting him there. I'm bringing him there. That's my duty." Naomi could hear the edge creeping into her voice now, but she didn't care. "I have authorization, military escort clearance. That should override any—" "It doesn't," the woman cut in. "I don't make the rules. You'll have to follow airline procedure like everyone else." Naomi clenched her jaw. She'd dealt with bureaucracy before. Cold, detached policies written by people who had never stood in a combat zone, never folded a flag, never knocked on a door to deliver the news that someone's son wasn't coming home. She inhaled sharply. "I need to speak with a supervisor." The agent rolled her eyes. "They'll tell you the same thing. Then let them tell me." With an exaggerated sigh, the woman grabbed her radio and mumbled something into it. Naomi took a step back, pulse thudding in her ears. This wasn't happening. She had carried Devin out of that last mission. She had spoken to his mother, looked into her hollow eyes, and promised that her son wouldn't be alone for a second of his journey home. And now, some airline policy was going to rip that away? "Excuse me, miss," Naomi turned at the voice. An older man had stood up from his seat nearby. Vietnam veteran. She recognized the insignia on his hat immediately. Deep lines cut through his face, his expression tight, like he'd heard enough. "What's the problem here?" he asked, voice gravelly but steady. Before Naomi could answer, the gate agent beat her to it. "Sir, this is a private matter." The veteran's gaze didn't move from Naomi's. "You a military escort?" "Yes, sir," Naomi answered. "And they won't let you stay with him?" "No, sir." A muscle worked in his jaw. Then, without another word, he turned to the gate agent and said, "That's unacceptable." But before the agent could respond, another voice chimed in. A woman clutching a folded flag in her lap. She had been listening, and she had something to say. The woman with the folded flag in her lap didn't hesitate. She stood, pressing the fabric close to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. A widow. Naomi knew it before she even spoke. "My husband died in Iraq," the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. "And when they brought him home, a soldier just like her stayed with him the entire way. Do you know what that meant to me? To my children?" Her eyes flicked to the gate agent. "You don't separate a fallen soldier from their escort. You just don't." The agent's expression faltered, but she didn't respond. Naomi swallowed hard. She didn't want a scene. She wanted to do her job. But the second the veteran and the widow had spoken up, other passengers had started to listen. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the gate area. "She's military," someone else said. "Why aren't they letting her do her job?" "That's disgusting," another voice added. "This shouldn't even be a debate." Naomi barely had time to process the growing attention before a tall man in a business suit rose from his chair. "I fly every week for work," he said. "I've seen airlines bend over backward for celebrities, for politicians. You're telling me they can't make an exception for this?" The gate agent's face flushed. "Sir, this is company policy. This is a soldier bringing another soldier home." The veteran cut in. His voice was sharper now, louder. "That means something. To people like me, to people like her." He gestured to the widow, "and to every damn person who ever served." A few people clapped. Others nodded in agreement. The murmur turned into something bigger. The gate agent shifted, clearly uncomfortable now. She reached for her radio again, muttering something Naomi couldn't hear. But before she could say anything else, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. The intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking. Can Sergeant Brooks please come to the podium?" Silence fell over the gate area. Naomi's stomach clenched. The pilot? Had he been listening? She exhaled slowly, adjusting her duffel strap before stepping forward. Whatever happened next, she wasn't backing down. Naomi stepped forward, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. The crowd had fallen silent, their anger replaced by curiosity, maybe even hope. Had the pilot been listening this whole time? The gate agent looked just as surprised as Naomi felt. She hesitated, then clicked her radio again. "Captain, this is—" "I heard everything," the voice interrupted, smooth but firm. "Sergeant Brooks, come to the desk, please." Naomi didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the counter, jaw tight, shoulders squared. The gate agent stepped aside, suddenly unsure of herself. A moment later, a tall man in his late 50s emerged from the jet bridge, still in his pilot's uniform. His silver hair was neatly combed, his airline insignia pinned to his chest. But it wasn't his appearance that struck Naomi. It was the way he looked at her, like he understood. He stopped in front of her and extended his hand. "Sergeant Brooks." She shook it, her grip firm. "Captain." He nodded, then turned toward the gate agent. His expression didn't change, but his next words carried a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "This soldier is staying with her comrade." The gate agent's mouth opened, then shut. "Captain, I just explained to her that—" "I know what you explained," he cut in. "I also know that the airline has made exceptions before. I know that it's well within my authority to request one now." His gaze sharpened. "And I am requesting one." A beat of silence. The agent shifted uncomfortably. "I'd need approval from—" "You have it," he interrupted. "I just spoke with corporate. They'll make it work." Naomi's chest tightened. Relief, gratitude, 100 emotions at once. She'd been ready to fight this all the way, but now she didn't have to. The widow exhaled softly, whispering, "Thank God." The veteran, still standing, crossed his arms with a satisfied grunt. "That's more like it." The business traveler gave a slow nod. "About time someone had some sense." The pilot turned back to Naomi. "You'll stay with him, Sergeant. Every step of the way." She swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, then glanced around at the crowd. His eyes landed on the widow, her flag still clutched to her chest. Something passed between them, something unspoken. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the jet bridge. The gate agent still looked rattled, but she didn't argue. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, then handed Naomi's paperwork back. "You're all set." Naomi took it without a word, gripping it tight, but she knew this wasn't over yet. Naomi should have felt relief. The captain had made his decision. The passengers were on her side. The airline had given its approval. But the gate agent? She still wasn't ready to let it go. Naomi caught the flicker of irritation on her face as she typed something into her computer, jaw tight. It wasn't just policy anymore. It was personal. She didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of a crowd. "Your seat has been reassigned," the woman said, not bothering to look up. Naomi's pulse ticked up. "What do you mean reassigned? You were originally in 14C. You've been moved to the last row." A ripple of tension passed through the waiting area. The Vietnam veteran let out a slow, measured breath, watching the exchange like a man who had seen this game played before. Naomi clenched her jaw. They couldn't keep her off the flight, but they could still make it difficult. She could fight it. Push back. Call the captain again. But the flight was boarding soon, and Devin was already on that plane, waiting. She inhaled through her nose. Pick your battles. This one wasn't worth it. "Fine." She took the boarding pass without another word. The gate agent smirked, but the expression faded when the business traveler from earlier stepped forward. "Actually, that seat's taken," he said, sliding his own boarding pass onto the counter. "She can have mine. First class 3A. Naomi's eyes snapped to him. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted. "Take it." The gate agent opened her mouth, then shut it, her cheeks reddening. She scanned the pass with a curt nod. "Fine, it's done." The business traveler turned to Naomi and clapped a hand on her shoulder. "You get him home, Sergeant." Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat. "I will." She didn't wait for the gate agent to say anything else. She walked past her, onto the jet bridge, and onto the plane. But she wasn't the only one boarding with a purpose. As Naomi stepped onto the plane, she felt the weight of the moment settle in. She had fought her way here, not just for herself but for Devin, for his mother, waiting on the other end of this flight, for every soldier who never made it home. She moved toward her new seat in first class, still stunned by the business traveler's quiet act of defiance, the kindness of strangers, the way people had stood up when it counted. But just as she reached her row, she noticed something unusual. The pilot was standing at the front of the plane, not in the cockpit, not running through pre-flight checks. He was waiting. The murmurs started the moment passengers spotted him. A flight attendant approached hesitantly, but he waved her off. Then, as the last of the boarding passengers found their seats, he took a slow step forward and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady over the intercom, "before we take off, I'd like to acknowledge someone on this flight." Naomi's stomach tightened. "She won't ask for recognition, and I doubt she wants it," he continued, scanning the cabin. "But she's earned it." He gestured toward Naomi. "Sergeant Brooks is escorting Corporal Devin Hayes home. She promised his family she'd see him all the way there, and she's keeping that promise." A hush fell over the plane. Then, one by one, people started clapping. Naomi didn't move at first. She sat frozen, trying to process what was happening. The Vietnam veteran in coach stood first, clapping the hardest. The widow wiped her eyes and joined in. Then more hands, more voices. Some passengers simply placed their hands over their hearts. Naomi swallowed, overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this, to people seeing, to people caring. The pilot nodded at her, just once, before stepping back into the cockpit. Naomi exhaled shakily. The gate agent had tried to make her feel small, But in this moment, surrounded by people who understood, she had never felt stronger. The plane took off, gliding into the sky as Naomi stared out the window, the weight in her chest finally beginning to settle. She kept one hand on her duffel, feeling the fabric beneath her fingers like it was an anchor. She didn't need thanks, didn't need applause. She just needed to get Devon home. A flight attendant approached her quietly, kneeling beside her seat. "Ma'am, we wanted to offer you something." Naomi turned, surprised. The woman held out a small tray. On it sat a neatly folded napkin, and resting on top, a set of pilot's wings. "Captain wanted you to have these," the attendant said softly. "He said he doesn't usually give them out, but he thinks you've earned them more than anyone." Naomi stared at the wings, her throat tight. She reached out, running her fingers over the smooth metal before closing her palm around them. "Thank you," she murmured. The attendant gave her a small nod before stepping away, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes, exhaustion creeping in. The past 24 hours had been a battle she hadn't expected. But as she sat there, surrounded by strangers who had refused to let her stand alone, she realized something. Honor wasn't just a word. It wasn't just a uniform, a salute, a folded flag. It was in the way people showed up, the way they stood when something wasn't right, the way a veteran still fought for respect decades after his own war had ended, the way a widow carried the weight of sacrifice in her hands, the way a pilot used his voice when others tried to silence her, the way a businessman who had nothing to gain gave up his seat without hesitation. Naomi looked down at the wings in her palm, her grip tightening. She would keep them. Not for herself, but for Devon. The plane touched down in Wichita hours later. As Naomi stepped off, she saw the Hayes family standing just beyond security. Devon's mother clutched a tissue in her hands, eyes red but steady. She was waiting for him. Naomi stood taller, adjusted her uniform, and took the first step forward. Because promises weren't just made, they were kept. Honor those who serve. If this story moved you, share it. Let their sacrifices be remembered.